Do you remember back when Osama bin Laden was America's biggest enemy? Osama bin Laden was the founder of Al Qaeda, the organization that took responsibility for the attacks on September 11th, 2001. Now, on that day, thousands of American lives were lost when 4 airliners were hijacked. One was forced down in a Pennsylvania field by the passengers who found out that the hijackers were planning to fly their plane into the White House, and all on board were killed. A second plane flew into the Pentagon building, and 2 other planes flew directly into the Twin Towers in New York, completely destroying the towers and killing all who remained in them. And nearly 3,000 people died that day in the hands of the terrorists. The United States responded with a war on terror and a mission to hunt down and kill or capture Osama bin Laden for what he had done. And 10 years later, in April 2011, intelligence discovered Osama bin Laden was hiding in a large house in Pakistan. So in the middle of the night, Navy SEALs flew into Pakistan in 2 Black Hawk helicopters. One of the helicopters actually experienced a soft crash landing, but the SEAL team on board was able to scale the wall of the compound and use explosives to enter. There were a lot of people living inside the compound, and they were all caught completely off guard. And the surprise element and the overwhelming force of the Navy SEALs made fighting back impossible. Well, in the end, Osama bin Laden was killed and the mission accomplished. I want you to notice 3 things about this mission to bring Osama bin Laden to justice. First, the planning of the mission. And second, the secrecy of the mission. And finally, the overwhelming force involved. Those who sought to get bin Laden knew they had to have a very good, detailed plan. They needed to get to bin Laden undetected, and they knew that those at the compound might very well fight for him, so they had to be prepared. When we consider Jesus' arrest, the same strategies were in force. The religious leaders devised a detailed plan on how they could arrest Jesus. They even used a spy in their plan, a disciple of Jesus named Judas. And they kept their plan secret and swooped in on him quickly in the middle of the night outside the city gates. And they came with a show of force, carrying swords and clubs just in case they met resistance. And as it turned out, they would meet resistance, but not from Jesus. It would be from one of his disciples. It would be mostly symbolic. It wasn't really much of a resistance. Because humanly speaking, there was no way that Jesus and his 11 followers were going to be able to successfully resist the show of force that came to arrest Jesus. But really, all these men with weapons weren't really necessary because Jesus had no intention at all to resist. His time had come. He was prepared to fulfill messianic prophecy and to follow the Father's will to die for the sins of the world. We read in Matthew 26, verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. So Judas arrived at the scene. And Judas wasn't just out for a walk that night. Judas was hunting Jesus. He'd worked out a deal with the religious leaders to turn Jesus over to them. The leaders had paid money for a service, and that service was probably to lead them to Jesus, where he could be arrested in a quiet place, with little danger of mob violence. Now, Judas, being one of the 12 disciples, he knew Jesus' usual places, and he may have first visited the upper room and found it empty. And so he guessed where Jesus and the disciples probably had gone. And Judas chose Gethsemane because Jesus had often come here with his disciples. It was a place of fellowship and prayer for them. And Judas knew that Jesus had a very difficult evening. After all, he was the cause of it. Judas knew that Jesus knew he was the betrayer, and he would soon be arrested. So knowing Jesus, Judas figured that under the stress, Jesus would need some time to pray. And his favorite place to get alone to pray while in this area was Gethsemane. But Judas didn't come alone. He was accompanied by a large crowd, and the crowd was sent by the chief priests and elders. The chief priests were high-level officials from the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of ancient Israel. They were second in power only to the high priest. And the elders were probably lay members of the Sanhedrin. They'd be heads of the most influential lay families. So the chief priests and elders, they were not to be messed with. They had power. And when they gave an order, it was carried out. John's Gospel says that Roman soldiers were also a part of the crowd that night. And it's likely that the soldiers came along because the Romans wanted to go the extra mile to ensure peace, especially during these feasts. Large crowds came from all around, and whenever masses of people gather, it's a good idea to increase security. When you go to the fair, there's a police presence. When you go to Dodger Stadium, you see the police patrolling. Their job is to keep the peace. And so with thousands of people pouring into Jerusalem during the Passover, the Romans patrolled to make sure there weren't any problems. A group of Roman soldiers were assigned to the temple for security, and these would be the soldiers who went with the crowd to find Jesus. And these soldiers were authorized to carry swords. These swords were short, double-edged swords that were used in hand-to-hand combat. Also along to maintain order would be the Levitical temple police and personal security of the chief priests and Sanhedrin. They'd be carrying the clubs to use if they found it necessary. The clubs and the swords indicate that they expected some trouble. In addition to the clubs and swords, John's Gospel says the crowd also had torches and lanterns. The torches and the lanterns would help them find their way. This was not only before the days of electric streetlights, but they were also going outside the city gates, where it would be particularly dark at night. But why was a large crowd necessary to arrest Jesus? It was a show of force, just in case they were met by resistance from Jesus' followers. There were a lot of people in Jerusalem, and perhaps they felt that some who were loyal to Jesus might somehow try to prevent the arrest. We see they also came in the middle of the night when most people would be asleep to help ensure that there wouldn't be any trouble. In addition to the concern about loyal followers rioting or fighting for Jesus, they also may have had a concern about Jesus' 11 loyal followers. In case they decided to fight, a large crowd with torches and swords would provide a large enough show of force to prevent the disciples from resisting. But there's one more thing that may have been on the religious leaders' minds. They had witnessed Jesus perform many miracles, and they knew that Jesus had supernatural powers, that he might just use them. So, when they come to arrest Jesus, they bring a whole crowd of armed men. They want to make sure that if Jesus tries something, they're ready for it. Well, Judas had arranged a signal to identify Jesus. Now, why was that necessary? Probably because the Roman soldiers who would be arresting Jesus were unfamiliar with him. And also, the arrest was taking place in the dead of night, so a sign would make it easier to find the right person quickly and take him away before the disciples could mount a resistance. Judas' signal was a kiss. How ironic is that? Now, back in those days, you kissed people that you liked, just as today. But in American culture, we tend to kiss either our romantic partner, such as our spouse, or the occasional family member, such as an aunt that always greets nieces and nephews with a kiss, or really close friends. But in Jesus' day, kisses were used as friendly greetings, somewhat like the handshake, or perhaps a hug is used in our culture. So it would not be odd at all for a student or a disciple to respectfully kiss his or her teacher. So Judas approaches Jesus and says, "Greetings, Rabbi." Think about that. He could have just pointed to Jesus from a safe distance as he whispered to the guard next to him, "Yeah, that's the guy." But he actually came up close to Jesus. He was face to face with him, looking him directly in the eye as he said, "Greetings, Rabbi." Judas takes an act of friendship and turns it into an act of treachery. Only seconds before, he would have told the crowd he came with, "The one I kiss is the man you want. Grab him." And what's with Judas calling him Rabbi? Jesus is not his teacher anymore. And what kind of friendly greeting is this? Judas comes leading a mob armed with clubs, swords, and torches, and then casually says to Jesus, "Hello there, Rabbi." It sounds so casual and friendly, but it was actually a heinous, hateful act. And following the fake greeting, Judas gives him a kiss. Judas twists this friendly greeting of friendship into a death sign. How unthinkable it is that one of the dozen people closest to Jesus on earth would end up betraying him. Jesus answers Judas's fake greeting and treacherous kiss by saying, "Do what you came for, friend." Jesus called Judas friend. Friend. I've been betrayed by friends before. And a true betrayal generally stops a friendship. But Jesus calls Judas a friend. Is this Jesus' way of saying that he really hasn't given up on Judas? That he loves him still? That even now, things haven't gone so far that Judas can't still repent? The irony, of course, is that while Jesus calls Judas friend, both Jesus and Judas know the treachery that's unfolding. Judas is certainly not acting as a friend. Verse 51. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Peter has one of his Peter moments and cuts off Malchus's ear. John identifies Peter as a swordsman and Malchus as the victim. So what in the world was Peter thinking? Well, he was doing his best to back up his boastful words that he made earlier. When Jesus had told his followers that they would all desert him, Peter would have none of it. And he strongly replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." So against insurmountable odds, Peter draws the sword to fight for Jesus. And as he wildly takes a swing at the nearest enemy, he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. One thing you could say on Peter's behalf, he was loyal to Jesus. And although misguided, he was willing to fight to defend him. My son's family used to have a dog named Corduroy. And Peter reminds me of Corduroy. Several years ago, Judy and I had a plumber at our house to do some work. And for some reason, Corduroy was staying at our house at the time. And Corduroy was always very protective of his people. He was just a little rat terrier, but he was willing to do whatever was needed to protect his pack. So we kept him locked up in our bedroom while the plumber was working, and all the while, Corduroy was just barking non-stop, warning the stranger that he's on to him. But then the plumber needed to do something in the bathroom off the master bedroom, so we had to put Corduroy outside. And the plumber finished the job and was about ready to leave. But we had one more question to ask him, because we wanted to know what would be involved in running a gas line to our fireplace. So the plumber said he'd go outside to take a look at the layout. But Corduroy was out there. So we warned the plumber that the dog was in the backyard. But the plumber said, it's okay. He probably thought, it's just a little dog. What can he do? Well, Corduroy showed him what he could do. So when the plumber walked out the back door, Corduroy barked and bared his teeth. And the plumber didn't heed the warning. And so in one swift and daring move, Corduroy ran behind the plumber, jumped up into the air, and bit the plumber in the butt. Corduroy may have been undersized, but he was ready to fight, to do whatever he felt necessary to protect his pack. And Peter had the same mindset. He might be overmatched in manpower and weapons, but he's going to do whatever necessary to protect his master. So just as Corduroy did, in one swift and daring move, Peter draws his sword and swings wildly at one of the arresting men and cuts off his ear. Well, Jesus immediately stops the violence, and he reprimands Peter, telling him to put your sword away. He said, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. In other words, violence leads to violence. At that time, the disciples had tried to fight the crowd. They'd all been killed. Another thing Jesus made clear to Peter, Jesus didn't need his help to defend himself. Jesus could have called more than 12 legions of angels to defend him, if he so chose. A legion is about 6,000 soldiers, so Jesus was saying that he could instantaneously have 72,000 angels there to defend him, if he so chose. Now understand that Jesus didn't have 72,000 cute little precious moments angels in mind here. Jesus was talking about warrior angels like Gabriel, who was depicted in TV in the Bible series a few years ago. And not just one warrior angel, although that would have been enough to do the job. Jesus said he could have 72,000 warrior angels there right then. And any one of those angels could have whipped Judas' mob with one hand tied behind his back. But Jesus could have called on 72,000 of them. Verse 55. In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion? You have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Jesus made a short speech to those arresting him. As major points, first, his arresters are using ridiculous tactics. They come at him with swords and clubs. But Jesus is a man of peace. Swords and clubs aren't necessary. Jesus voluntarily surrendered himself. His second point is that his captors are cowards. Jesus was not a dangerous criminal. He was a religious leader who had been teaching in the temple courts every day during the past week. They could have arrested him any time. However, they come in the middle of the night to arrest him, fearing the crowds. And his third point, that in spite of the evilness of their act, it was all taking place as fulfillment of prophecy. At this very point, as Jesus was standing up to Judas's posse and calling them cowards, his disciples all ran away. They were scared. They saw no hope. There was no way to successfully fight the crowd. They were outmatched. And we pointed out earlier that Peter had boasted that he would never run away, and that he was willing to die for Christ. Well, Matthew's gospel tells us that when Peter finished his proud boast, all the other disciples said the same thing. They were all big talkers, all willing to pledge their undying devotion to Jesus. But when push came to shove, they all ran away and they all deserted him. It seems like such a sad story. But don't miss this one thing, that God is in control. Sure didn't seem like it in Gethsemane. Judas betrayed Jesus, selling him out to his enemies. And Jesus seemed to be having a meltdown as he prayed. He's so overwhelmed that he says he feels like he's going to die. And the disciples fell asleep when they should have been keeping watch and praying. Judas easily found Jesus at Gethsemane and brought with him a large crowd carrying torches and armed with clubs and swords. Peter foolishly slices off the ear of the high priest's servant. The disciples all freak out and take off for the hills. And then Jesus was arrested, led away to ultimately face his death. But read again what Jesus said at the time of his arrest. But this has all taken place, that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. As strange as it seemed, what Jesus was going through fulfilled Scripture. It was according to plan, all of it. As this awful night continued with a mock trial, a brutal beating, and a horrible death, it was still according to God's plan. We know the plan did not end with Jesus' death, for included in God's plan was a glorious resurrection. And Jesus would live again and live eternally. God's will would ultimately be accomplished, although at the time it looked like Jesus had been miserably defeated. God was in control. And God is still in control. As we live in this world, there will be days when it looks like Satan has won the battle. But God sees the big picture. God knew that the arrest of Jesus and the crucifixion were not the final chapter. There would be a resurrection day. And he knows too that although Satan may claim an occasional victory today, God will ultimately be victorious and his will accomplished. And Jesus will return to rule and reign forever. Why? Because God is in control.